Thanks for giving an opportunity today for to be talking a little bit about maximizing habitat values and habitat functions in urban landscapes. And today, what I'm going to do, I have a few things I'm going to talk about today. First of all, I'm going to introduce you to an exciting new program. It's called Heritage Growers. It's a new native nursery and seed supply company. Pretty exciting stuff, something I think that that everyone that's participating on this call will enjoy. Then I'm going to talk about, how to maximize habitat values in urban landscapes. And then at the end, I'm going to talk to you about a project I had in my South Davis neighborhood that became a class for UC Davis. It was a habitat project. Some pretty interesting findings, I think, that ties together well with everything we're going to be talking about today. So, okay, so first of all, Heritage Growers, it's a brand new native seed and supply company. Basically, what we're doing is we're producing native seed and plants of known genetic origin for habitat restoration. And we're trying to do this as much as possible with partnerships and collaborations. We're trying to advance the science of using seed and plugs for habitat restoration. And at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is improve habitat restoration outcomes. And what it is, it's a program of River Partners. And probably a lot of you have heard about River Partners. River Partners is a nonprofit organization that's been implementing large-scale habitat restoration projects for more than 2 decades. They've literally restored more than 18,000 acres of riparian habitat over these last 20 plus years. So it's always been sort of the dream of River Partners to be able to produce their own seed. They've done a really great job over the years of collecting wildland seed and effectively using that on their projects, and then buying commercially available seed. But they've always wanted to have their own farm to produce their own seed, and that's really what Heritage Growers is. It's the native seed and nursery program of River Partners. And so it's really is kind of an expansion of what was kind of an informal program in the past. Like I said, River Partners used to do a really good job of sort of collecting wildland seed and using that on the restoration projects. But really, it was fairly informal. And so now this program that we've launched here, Heritage Growers, it's a much more organized sort of program. It's a combination of both wildland seed collected as well as farm produced seed. And we're just getting off the ground. We planted our first 11 acres of that this fall. And then, this winter, and then this fall, we're going to be expanding significantly. We're going to be adding another 155 acres. So this is a large scale native seed program that's just getting off the ground. We have a native nursery. It's up and running. We're providing mostly plugs, again, of known genetic origin of native plants. And we're hoping to really try to develop more ecotypes and more species. And with that, we hope to improve habitat values and restoration outcomes. And again, trying to advance the science and practice of using seed and plugs in habitat restoration. So here's a slide that kind of shows, our farm here, this sort of triangular piece. You can see that here, that's our 11 acres that we just finished planting right there. We're planting more than 150 species and ecotypes within these 11 acres. What we're doing is we're increasing some of the wildland collections that we did here in 2021. We're establishing species to provide seed for our native plant nursery. We're doing new trials with new ecotypes and new species. And more than anything else, we're trying to learn how to seed farm here at Davis Ranches. It's a farm that's located between Colusa and Grimes in Colusa County, right adjacent to the Sacramento River, basically where the Sacramento River meets Sycamore Slough. And so an important part of producing native seed, of course, is seed cleaning and testing. And if you look at the slides at the top there, that's kind of shows how River Partners has been cleaning its seed for all these years. Basically a manual operation of kind of cleaning that seed with screens. But right now we're in the process of setting up a formal seed cleaning mill. We've got about half of our equipment's been purchased. And basically, as we produce this large amounts of seed, we'll be, using mechanized cleaning equipment as part of it. And then we're also going to be doing a lot of testing. Testing is an essential part of growing out native seed and also the stock seed that's collected from the wild. It's really important to understand the purity and the viability of the seed. you need to figure out the number of live seeds in order to figure out sort of how to proceed. So we're working with some really high quality native seed labs to really get some good data for us as we move forward. A lot of what we're going to be doing are contract grow seed amplifications, where we take small amounts of seed that are collected in the wild and essentially grow them out. We'll be doing that for specific projects where the local material is really desired, or maybe the ecotypes that are commercially available aren't quite adequate for a given project. So again, we'll be taking this wildland seed, we'll take like a pound of seed and turn that into 100 pounds so that we can make an appreciable difference with specific habitat restoration projects. Most of the time when you're doing contract grow seed amplifications, the desire is to start out and plant the material directly from seed, but a lot of times it's really difficult to get enough seed to be able to plant directly. And so more often than not, we'll end up taking that seed and then planting that into plugs and then putting those out in the field. We'll also be growing out native grasses, and with that, we'll be producing native grass straw, which you folks that work in the habitat restoration field understand that native straw is a really great product for habitat restoration, really good for erosion control. We'll be working with Colusa County so they can inspect our fields and certify that the straw that we produce is noxious weed free. And one of the great things, of course, about native grass straw is it generally contains some native grass seed, right? So anyway, so we'll be planting our native grasses starting this coming fall, and so our straw will be available in fall of 2023. We also have our native plug nursery. It's up and running right now. We have dozens of species, dozens of different ecotypes, and tens of thousands of plants of known genetic origin. The plant material is it's generally plugs. These are small herbaceous plants, very cost effective, very high quality plants. The plants are grown with phytosanitary best management practices. It's really important, as probably many of you know, to with native plant nurseries, you have to implement clean nursery practices so you don't end up causing phytophthora to occur within your nursery and spreading these non-native diseases into wildland settings. So we're growing out, our growing operation includes phytophthora BMPs. We'll be doing a lot of contract grows. And we're doing research and collaborations as part of this. For example, one of the things that we're doing right now is we're working with the Xerces Society. I'm sure a lot of you are working hard to try to help the monarch butterfly recover. One of the things that we're doing is trying to unlock how to effectively grow Asclepias californica, the California milkweed. One of the things is probably most of you know is that the migratory patterns of monarch butterflies have been disrupted with climate change, right? They're leaving their overwintering grounds much earlier than they used to, and they're out of sync with many milkweed species, right? So they're migrating, looking for milkweed to lay their eggs on, and essentially most of the milkweed's not up. But Asclepias californica, that's one of the early emerging milkweeds, right? So anyway, so we're trying to figure out how to grow that out, try to get more of the Asclepias californica out there as a sort of a measure to try to help the monarch butterfly. So it's kind of an example of some of the work that we're doing with partners and some of the research that we're doing as part of Heritage Growers. Another great thing about being a project of River Partners is that we have the River Partners deep experience in habitat restoration. So we'll have the ability to be able to implement restoration projects with the seed and the plants that we produce when applicable. And of course, Heritage Growers will provide the technical support for the seeds and the plants that are provided to these projects. And then, we're looking for volunteers or folks who are interested in sort of learning a little bit more about what we're doing here. We have a demonstration garden. We're going to be doing significant wildland collections we need that wildland stock seed to start new ecotypes and new species. There'll be opportunities for data analysis and collection. So if folks are interested, reach out to us, help us to advance the science of using native seeds and native plugs and habitat restoration. And I think the last slide that I have has my contact information if folks are interested in that. Okay, very good. So now I think we're going to talk a little bit about what we came here today primarily for, and that's maximizing habitat values and function in urban landscapes. So one of the things here, hang on a second here. There we go. Okay, so one of the important things when you're trying to really maximize habitat values is to use native species. You know, I know I'm speaking to the choir here, but you know, we know from the work of Gordon Franke, for example, at UC Berkeley, and the habitat work that we've done in my neighborhood at the UC Davis class. Basically, we know that native species generally provide higher habitat values than non-native species. So you want to start off and you want to use native species whenever possible. You know, and I would say, you know, 100% native species, right? And then beyond that, you want to try to use species whose historic range occurs within your project area as best you can, right? So there's a great resource I'm sure a lot of you know of, CalFlora. If you type in the scientific name into Google, generally speaking, one of the first things that pops up is CalFlora, and the first page is this beautiful distribution map. And from that, you get a really good idea of where the distribution of the native species are. So it's a really great way to sort of get that initial take about where the historic range of the native species are. And then from that, try to use, you know, native species whose range, to the extent possible, covers your project site. Let's see. 1 second here, guys. Okay, very good. So now if you go beyond that, you know, try to use plant material of known genetic origin, right? The local ecotypes, right? We know that local ecotypes, they have co-evolved with local conditions. In general, they're going to be better adapted to the regional soils, the climates, the insects, and the diseases, right? So whenever possible, you know, try to use the material that came from existing wildland areas within your region. You know, it's going to be a much better result, I think, in the long term. You're going to have a more resilient landscape. So I think for the most part, it's fair to ask your seed and nursery suppliers, you know, what's the origin of the plant material that you're buying, you know? You know, and if the answer is, I don't know, you know, that's called VNS, variety not stated. Keep that in mind, right? So all things being equal, if you have something where you know where the origin of the material came from, where was that original wildland collection, or you don't know, then you should try to use the material where you know where it originally came from. So to the extent possible, you know, try to use those local ecotypes. And I perfectly understand that, you know, a lot of material isn't necessarily available, so you'll have to compromise a little bit sometimes, but to the extent possible, try to use plant material of known genetic origin. Okay, another important thing is to include a diverse assembly of species, right? You want to make sure that your native garden has lots of different plant families that are represented. We know that there is, for example, a relationship between species diversity and pollinator diversity. Generally speaking, if you're going to end up with more species, you're going to have more pollinator habitat, more pollinator species. Now, so you got to keep in mind that bees, for example, oftentimes specialize in flower structure, right? And so if you have lots of different families, you're going to end up with lots of different flower structures, and you're going to end up with lots of different bee species, for example. Also, you want to try to make sure that you have a diverse array of species that provide flowers throughout the growing season, right? So you want to target trying to get at least 3 species that are going to be flowering early, 3 species that are flowering middle, and 3 species that are flowering late. So that throughout the growing season, kind of between that sort of February and November time period, you're going to end up always having something in bloom. So having those pollinator resources, that nectar and that pollen available is an important part of providing high quality habitat. And so if you end up using, you know, a diverse assemblage of species, what you're naturally going to do is create complex habitat, and complex habitat in and of itself creates extra habitat value, right? So you're looking for biodiversity and habitat complexity when you're assembling your habitat garden. Another thing to keep in mind is moth and butterfly host plant species, right? We know that moths and butterflies have co-evolved with plant species, and they can't necessarily complete their life cycles on any vegetation. They have very specific habitat requirements. So you want to make sure you use moth and butterfly species to the extent possible as part of your garden design. You know, I think I saw Doug Talmy in the presentation. His name was brought up earlier today, and he's done a lot of great research. He's an entomology professor at the University of Delaware. And so one of the things that he really cues in on are these moths and butterflies. And some of the things that he's found out, and some things that I guess we already know, is that, nesting birds, for example, they really rely on those caterpillars to be able to successfully forage their young. They have a lot of protein, right? And so if you want to have lots of nesting birds, within your neighborhood or within your region, you want to make sure you're providing lots of species that provide host plants, that are host plants for moths and butterflies. And another great resource, which is another CNPS related resource, is Calscape, calscape.org. It basically lists, if you go into Google, again, type in the scientific name, Calscape is often one of the things that pop up. It's going to list the known and likely host plants of various species. So it's really a great resource to figure out, which particular species provide abundant, habitat for moths and butterflies. Another thing you want to do is you want to make sure you're including both perennials and annuals. Perennials, of course, provide important structure for your landscape. They live longer, so they're more resilient. They add to that important biodiversity. If they're evergreen, they're going to provide year-round cover. And of course, annuals really provide a lot of diversity, and of course, they provide a lot of habitat values for pollinators. So if you put those perennials and those annuals together, what you're going to end up doing is creating a very complex habitat structure. And again, that complex habitat structure is one of the keys to providing high-value habitat. Native bunch grasses. So I was really pleased to hear Noreen early on. She asked me if I would talk a little bit about native bunch grasses. I was really pleased to hear that chapter is very interested in that. Native bunch grasses are really an important component of habitat gardens. They provide great foundations for habitat gardens. They really sort of set the stage for everything that grows in between. A lot of times they're host plants for moths and butterflies. The moths and butterflies will lay their eggs on bunch grasses. Those, of course, will turn into caterpillars or then feed onto those bunch grasses. So they are in and of themselves, pollinator habitat plants. But some of the other habitat functions that they provide is that a lot of native bunch grasses have very deep roots. And nowadays, with climate change, it's really important that we try to maximize water infiltration, right? We want to hold on to that water as much as possible. We've seen this year, and I think this is what we're supposed to be seeing here in the future, is that we're going to see more powerful rainstorms that come in and dump large amounts of water. And then we're going to have significant dry periods in between. So it's really important that we capture as much of that water as we possibly can. And so those deep roots that are associated with these native bunch grasses, they provide channels that go deep into the soil profile. And so that water then becomes plant available in between the storms and during the dry period. So you want to really maximize that infiltration and hold on to that soil moisture. So it's a really great way to do that. Of course, native grasses also do a great job of building soils. As their roots expand and contract, essentially they do a great job of adding organic matter to the soil. They're in the process, they're sequestering carbon, basically taking carbon from the atmosphere, putting that into the roots. And in the process of doing that carbon, that organic matter that's in there essentially helps to provide natural fertility. It helps to hold on to the water. It's really a great thing. And one thing to keep in mind also is that you want to use a diverse array of grass species, right? So different native grasses have different rooting structures. If you really want to maximize that carbon sequestration, you want to use a diverse array of different native grass species so you can maximize that sequestration. I read a paper here, a month or two ago that talked about, at least on the East Coast, comparing like diverse native grass prairies versus non-diverse native grass prairies, and the areas that had that high diversity end up being much better at sequestering carbon. Perennial flowers. Okay, so you want to, the perennial flowers, just like the native bunch grasses, provide those important foundational plants. You want to make sure that you're using lots of perennial flowers, because they live longer. Of course, they're going to be it's going to make your garden more resilient. It's going to add to your diversity, and because they oftentimes have at least a semi-woody structure, they're going to help provide that important habitat complexity, right? You want to have things that are herbaceous and things that are semi-woody as part of sort of, again, developing this complex habitat structure. Okay, annual wildflowers. I think probably everyone on this call really loves annual wildflowers, right? They're spectacular. They provide really high habitat values for pollinating insects. They're just a great addition to the garden, and it's a really nice way to add diversity, right? So you can add a native wildflower mix to your habitat garden, and you can add 8 or 10 or 12 different species just by, properly applying and getting those native wildflowers to establish. So use plentiful annual wildflowers in your habitat gardens. I'm not going to talk too much about individual species, but I will talk about milkweed. Of course, milkweed is the host plant for monarch butterflies. Monarchs can't survive without milkweed, so they're really an important plant, an essential plant for monarch butterflies. They're also a really great pollinator and insectivorous species as well. Even in the absence of monarch butterflies, they're a great habitat plant. But probably, a lot of you probably know they're kind of a challenge to establish, right? I've heard lots and lots of stories of folks like trying to establish milkweed over and over again and not having much success. Part of the reason why is, the seed doesn't even germinate until this time of year, right? And so you can imagine the competition that milkweed have with non-native annual grasses and even other native species that germinate in the fall in the early winter, while milkweed is sitting in the soil as an ungerminated seed. So by the time that milkweed has an opportunity to be able to germinate and grow, it's facing some very stiff competition. So anyway, back when I was the general manager at Hedgerow Farms, one of the first things I did is I started a trial looking at different methods of trying to establish milkweed. We looked at seeds, we looked at plugs, and we even tried rhizomes from showy milkweed. And we also did some collaboration with the Xerces Society and the NRCS, who did a companion trial with milkweed. And basically what we found is that, you can establish milkweed, but it takes extra care and attention, right? So you really need to weed very extensively. Most milkweed tend to like it a little bit wetter. So if you have some wetter sites in your yard, you want to cheat those generally to the wetter locations. You want to give them probably a little bit of water generally, compared to some other things if you really want them to establish. So the two most common milkweed that are available is Asclepias fascicularis, the narrowleaf, and Asclepias speciosa. That's the showy milkweed, and both of those are both the easiest to establish, and they're also the most commercially available, right? So if you haven't really started establishing milkweed in your habitat gardens, those are a couple of good species to start with. You're probably going to have the most success with that. But then, once you've got your feet wet, if you will, then you can add some more milkweed diversity. You maybe challenge yourself and see if you can get a few more species established. So one of the things that the monarch butterfly biologists are recommending is not to plant milkweed within 5 miles of the coast. We were talking earlier about the migratory patterns of monarch butterflies being disrupted. And one of the things they don't want is monarchs to leave their migratory areas and basically find milkweed very close to where they're overwintering, and essentially not complete their migratory, have that disrupt their migratory pattern. So if you're within 5 miles of the coast, it's probably best not to plant milkweed, but it's certainly a great idea to plant lots of wildflowers, right? Pollen and nectar is a really important resource for monarch butterflies to make it through their very long journey and their very complex migrations. So anyway, and I'm not going to talk about trees too much, except I'm going to talk about one, and that's the valley oak. And I actually realized that a lot of folks maybe are joining in today from the peninsula, and perhaps in your neighborhoods or areas where you might have a habitat garden, perhaps coast live oak is the more appropriate species. So think about this as when I'm talking about valley oaks here, I think you can apply coast live oak as well. They're relatively similar. If coast live oak is more appropriate species. Anyway, so valley oak, Quercus lobata, it's endemic to California, right? It occurs nowhere else. And it's the largest oak in North America. And I think it's probably the largest oak in the world, right? these things grow to enormous sizes. But really, the great thing about valley oak is they support an abundance and diversity of insects. It always gets back to the insects, right? They really are a great habitat species because of that. You know, if you go back to Calscape, we were talking about that earlier. You look at valley oak, they have 17 confirmed and 151 likely moth and butterfly species that use the valley oak as a host plant. You know, and the habitat values of valley oak are backed up by studies. There's one in particular that's really good. It was done in 2018 by Dana Rollo and Steve Greco from UC Davis. And what they did is they went out to a neighborhood in Sacramento, a place called Curtis Park. This really nice sort of leafy neighborhood that mostly has these large ornamental trees, but it also has some patches, some small groves of valley oak. And what they did is they did a study of the migratory birds in Curtis Park. And essentially what they found is that despite the fact that valley oak is only a small component of that urban canopy, of that urban forest, almost all of the migratory birds were in the valley oaks as compared to the ornamental trees, right? These migratory birds have recognized that valley oaks provide a lot of food. And so if you're on a long migration, they understand that that's the place to rest and to feed. And so again, valley oak, a really high habitat species. So another thing to keep in mind too is that you want to keep that leaf litter, right? That leaf litter actually is a really important component. A lot of the moths need that leaf litter to complete their life cycle. You know, their chrysalis basically fall into that leaf litter, and it's an important part of that. So if you go in and you rake up, you know, all of those leaves, you're actually raking up a lot of those moths that you're trying to create as part of this. So I'd say at the end of the day, if you're looking for a single conservation action that you can do, I'd plant a valley oak. So that's my opinion. Okay, so now just talking about some more general things here. You know, plant layer stratification is really an important part of maximizing habitat values, right? So if you have a place where you have the ability to incorporate tree and shrub and herbaceous layers, that's a great way to add a lot of habitat values. Each of those different layers is going to provide a different suite of species, habitat for a different suite of species. It creates that important habitat complexity that we're talking about. So when you can, you know, try to create that plant layers, those stratifications, that plant layer stratification to provide you with that complex habitat. Water features are really an important part of, or can really add a lot of value to habitat gardens. And I know that like you know, a lot of us were really concerned about using water. And one of the things I wanted to mention is that, you know, by having some aquatic features, some water features as part of your garden, I think of that as environmental water. I think it's okay to add some water to your gardens because it really can add a lot of value, right? You know, if you have areas that are wet, you can add more plant species, right? It gets back to that more, adding that more of that diversity, right? And of course, it's a water source for things like birds and bees and other wildlife species. It adds that habitat complexity that we've been talking about. It does things like adding muddy soil areas where butterflies really need that, you know, in order to obtain nutrients. So, you know, so if you can add water features to your habitat gardens. Boulders are a great thing to add as well. They add a lot of complexity to gardens. They add nooks and crannies for different species to occupy. They add important visual interest, right? They can provide cover for predators. So, you know, if in the event that you can add boulders, you know, I think it's a nice addition to a habitat garden. Coarse woody debris. Okay, coarse woody debris, one of my favorite things to add to a garden. It adds that important structural complexity that we've been talking about so far. We know that there are a number of different bee species that need wood to nest in. So by adding coarse woody debris, you're adding potential nesting sites for some nesting bee species. They provide overwintering habitat for native insects, you know, that might hunker down underneath the logs, for example. It adds that important organic matter to the soil. You know, as they begin to decompose, that organic matter is added to the soil. That adds to the natural fertility of the soil. It helps to hold on to the water, right? some of those logs and that decaying wood can really act as a sponge again to hold on to that water, like we were talking about, the importance of that. It provides important habitat as it begins to decay for things like wasps and ants and bees. So lots of different values with that. So one of the things that I recommend, if you're ever having tree work done on your house or a neighbor or in the neighborhood, go approach the tree trimmers and say, hey, I'd like you to keep as many of the large branches as you can, particularly the ones at the end of the trees, those last sort of 15 feet where you get a lot of complexity, right? Lots of curves and things like that look really good in your garden. So hold on to that. Don't wood chip everything, and don't turn it all into firewood. Don't have it shipped off to the landfill. Try and keep those logs and those branches to the extent possible, because it really provides a lot of great habitat values. Substrate. So substrate's a really important part of providing high value habitat. And so with that, you want to make sure that you're including both mulched areas and bare soil areas. So we know that mulch areas provide a lot of habitat function. They, of course, help to retain moisture as they decompose. That mulch and that leaf litter helps to build the soil. Great way to control weeds. I think we all know about controlling weeds and the necessity of that, so that we can have time to do other things like planting, of course. It increases that infiltration into the soil like we were talking about. And it provides a lot of important habitat for insects, for example, invertebrates that use that duff layer, if you will. So it's important in and of itself for a lot of different species. But it's also really important that you provide bare soil areas as well. We know that the majority, I think it might be something like 70% of native bees nest in the ground. And those bees are not going to nest in 3 or 4 inches of leaf litter or wood mulch, right? So you have to have, if you want to have ground nesting bees, you have to have some bare soil areas. And I think in a lot of times, I think it's the ground nesting habitat that's more limiting, I think, than even floral resources. So really go out of your way to try to make sure you maintain some areas that are bare soils, so you can have more bee species that are present. So if you put it together, you want to have both mulched areas and non-mulched areas. And you put those two things together, you get that really important habitat complexity, and that improves habitat values in your garden. Okay, great. So now I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about my neighborhood habitat project. I think it ties in really nicely with what we're talking about today. I call it the Willow Bank Habitat Improvement Program. And basically, it's neighbors that are working together in this very special neighborhood that I live in South Davis. It's a neighborhood that has large lots. It's in the county, not the city, so it's adjacent to the city of Davis, but it's in the county, so it doesn't have street lights, it doesn't have sidewalks, just a really, really special place. This program really began, I think, almost 20 years ago, or about 18 years ago, when the Chinese hackberry trees that are in our neighborhood began to fail. These hackberry trees, they're planted in the late 1940s. They live about 50 years, and they began to fail, essentially kind of raining down branches onto cars and blocking streets and things like that as these trees began to fail. And so the neighbors got together, and what we ended up doing is planting, trees in between the hackberry trees. So as these hackberry trees began to decline, there would be a tree that was in place to replace that, and so with that, the majority of the trees that we used in the first round of planting were valley oak. And then we did a second round of planting, and we used all valley oak as part of that, right? So we're basically replacing these non-native trees with this somewhat limited lifespan with these valley oaks that are better adapted to local conditions. And then 5 or 6 years ago, maybe 7 years ago, we expanded to include pollinator habitat, basically establishing native wildflowers with those valley oaks in different locations to basically improve habitat values. And anyway, there's a professor at UC Davis. His name is Mark LaBelle. He's a social scientist. He loves these projects where social science and natural resources come together, and he got wind of this neighborhood habitat project, and we started to talk about it. And pretty soon, in the spring of 2018, a class was developed specifically around this neighborhood habitat project. And the class was called Social Ecological Connectivity in an Urban Context, right? So where social science and ecology sort of comes together. Kind of a mouthful, but pretty cool title anyway, too, right? So anyway, here's a picture of the class. A lot of these, bright students that came up to sign up for this class. A lot of enthusiasm. Had to cut the class off. Actually had more people than we were supposed to admit to the class, so a lot of enthusiasm and interest in this class. We looked at a bunch of different sort of ecological elements to it, but we had about 18 of the households within the Willowbank neighborhood participated in the study, and we looked at a bunch of different things, including valley oak ecology. So we looked at things like the number of trees, the size, the health and vigor. We looked at plant ecology. We looked at the species diversity that was present, the different species, both within the pollinator habitat patches, as well as in the controls, which were the traditional sort of landscaped areas. We looked at pollinator ecology. We worked with Neil Williams at UC Davis, really good pollinator ecologist. Basically, we came up with a methodology to be able to determine the pollinator use per unit area. So if you had a certain size of a pollinator patch, you would basically sample for pollinating insects within the timed amount, so you'd get an idea of the number of pollinator species that were present with a given unit area. And we did the same thing with the non-native areas, the traditional landscaped areas, and did some comparisons with that. There was spatial analysis that was done, things like mapping the trees and doing some social network analysis, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And then the social science component was really interesting. So the students, the social science team would sit down with the various participants and ask them, basically interview them, kind of an open-ended interview. Took about 45 minutes to an hour with each of the participants. Ask them questions about their environmental values, their interest in valley oak ecology and pollinator ecology, and tried to get sort of a sense for, kind of why they're participating in the project. And then one of the really sort of cool things about this also is they had a sheet of paper that had everybody in the neighborhood. And so they put a check mark to anybody in the neighborhood that they talked to about the pollinator habitat or the habitat project, basically. So from that, they could see how is this habitat project connecting the neighbors, So if you had more check marks, you had more social connections. If you had less, you had less, for example. So anyway, some of the sort of interesting results. So one of the fun things that we did is we did an analysis of some old aerial photos to get a sense for how valley oak, the canopy of valley oak had changed through time. So if you look on the left-hand side there, on the left-hand side of your screen, there's a 1937 photo. And that's back when Willowbank was just a wheat field. And at the time, there's very few valley oaks, just a few along the edges, basically. And then we took another look in 1952, and, kind of the same, somewhat the same. Not too many valley oaks were present at that time. But you could see Willowbank was starting to form here. If you look, here's those Chinese hackberry trees that we were talking about. They were planted in the late 1940s, and already by 52, you could see them on aerial photos. But again, not too much additional canopy cover. But if you go all the way to 2018, right, the valley oak canopy cover actually increased quite a bit, right? And so through time, going from a wheat field, into this sort of special neighborhood with these large lots, the valley oak canopy has increased. It's kind of moving towards sort of a little bit of an urban / rural valley oak woodland in some regards, I guess. But what they found too is that the trees tended to be very healthy. We ended up with sort of a health and vigor scale that we made for the trees. Almost all of them had the highest level of health and vigor, very different from those Chinese hackberry trees that had sort of, basically got to the end of their useful life and died off. They found that there was a nice diverse set of size classes, all the way from seedlings to saplings to small trees to large trees, which was great to hear. And then we confirmed what a lot of us know, is that when conditions are good, when you have good soils and some water, valley oaks are actually very fast growing. So if you look at the valley oak in my backyard, when my house was built in 1960, there was no valley oak back there. basically what ended up happening is that there was a leaky faucet in the backyard where Scrub Jay must have planted that acorn back there sometime after 1960. And today that tree is more than 40 inches in diameter and it dominates the backyard. So that valley oak in sort of less than 60 years has become a very large tree. So they grow very, very fast if the conditions are right. So pretty interesting results with the valley oak. The plant ecology results were actually pretty interesting as well. Came up with 53 different native plant species that were present within both the control, well, within the pollinator plots primarily. There was a relationship between the patch size and the plant and insect diversity. As the patches got bigger, as you might imagine, you end up getting more plant and more insect species that are present. There was higher plant diversity in the pollinator plots versus the controls, as you can imagine. And one of the recommendations that the students had was to, always to plant a diverse assemblage of species, which I thought was pretty cool that they had come up with that. The pollinator ecology results were pretty interesting as well. So these pollinator plots, they had higher insect diversity than the controls, which was great to see. Good relationship there. Yeah, and they also found that that the plant diversity was tied to pollinator diversity, right? So kind of what we were talking about earlier. The more plant diversity that was present, the more pollinator diversity that was present. So again, the importance of planting lots of different species in your habitat gardens, it's kind of borne out in this study amongst many others. Okay, the social science stuff was pretty interesting. This thing that looks kind of like a spiral graph here, I don't know if you remember that as kids, but those old spiral graphs. This is a social network analysis, and what it is that you can see the red dots. They're the participants in the project, and the non-participants are in blue. And basically, this gets back to that checklist I was talking about before. So it basically shows the connections that people made. Anytime that you talk to somebody about the pollinator project, there was a connection that was made. And the larger the circle, the more connections. And you kind of see here, that's me, Reynolds, there in the middle, because I'm kind of leading the project. My circle is larger, right? Anyway, but it's kind of a great way to see so the connections that were made here by implementing this project in the neighborhood. Kind of a nice way to see that nice illustration of that. Yeah. So anyway, this project actually increased the social connectivity, right? Clearly, some of the things that came out of the sort of some of the questionnaires included the fact that folks have a really keen sense of place. They really like Willowbank. They take a lot of pride of living in this very special place. People tend to have very strong environmental values. They recognize the importance of strong leadership, really. To pull off a project like this, you really had to have somebody that took the bull by the horns. One of the sort of the really cool things that came out of this also is that there seemed to be a relationship between the ecological diversity and the social connectivity. So sites that had more diversity ended up having more social connections. So kind of an interesting result. So some of the things that sort of, kind of the broader things that came out of this is that, we found that the valley oak, the canopies increased through time, and they increased through both natural recruitment as well as the planting efforts that were done in the neighborhood. We confirmed that valley oaks grow very quickly in our neighborhood, and they generally have a very high health and vigor. We know that the pollinator diversity is tied to plant diversity. Again, the more diversity of the plants, the more diversity of your pollinators. That we know that the pollinator and the plant diversity is higher within our habitat plots as compared to the control. And kind of at the end of the day, if you put it all together, what this project did is it actually increased the health of the social and the ecological health of our neighborhood. So kind of a neat finding there. So anyway, wanted to give credit to some of the various photos that were in this presentation today, including the late great John Anderson, right? One of the most important people in California in terms of establishing natives that we all use today, amongst other folks. And that's it. I welcome any questions that folks have. Here's my contact information if people want to ask me any questions or give me a call, feel free to do so. Always happy to talk about natives and creating habitats. So that's it.
Wow, thanks so much, Patrick. That was wonderful. Really enjoyed it. And there's a lot of great chat going on with resources amongst people, but also there's 15 questions in the Q&A if you've got some bandwidth to answer some questions.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Yeah, okay, yeah, I can do. So it looks like the first one is asking. Yeah, if you want to read it, go ahead. You want to read them out, and I'll kind of.
I could, sure. It might make it easier on you. The first one is from an anonymous, but good question. Do you know of any successful uses of native plantings for pollinators in urban landscapes as mitigation for CEQA? Conservation easements, deed restrictions don't seem to work well in urban or suburban areas. Yeah,
that's a great question. Yeah, so CEQA mitigation within urban areas. You know, I don't know specifically of any projects like that, but I think you know, in general, establishing natives and pollinator habitats within urban settings is an important sell for projects. So if you're a project proponent, say for example in the city of Davis, you know, part of the way that they sell these projects is they basically talk about things like open space corridors and using native species. And so I guess it's kind of an indirect way. I don't know if it's a specific CEQA mitigation, but I think that that these can help to mitigate the potential impacts. I think we can in urban settings provide, as I talked about today, good habitat within urban settings. So so it's maybe not a specific CEQA mitigation measure, but certainly part of making a project more benign. Yeah. So
nice.
Yep. So Irina asks, what species do you use for your native straw?
Yeah, that's great. Well, so the native straw species are the ones that there's enough straw that's produced where you can actually bale it. And so stipa species will produce enough native straw. Things like Elymus glaucus is another native straw species. Elymus triticoides is a really good one. A lot of vegetative matter with that. So yeah, it's there are several different ones. There's some stuff that doesn't produce enough straw where you can bale it, you know, like Festuca microstachys, for example, is one that you can't really bale. Sometimes you can, but generally speaking, it's like, and it's the majority of native grasses that you can basically, you know, have enough material that you can produce native grass straw bales. Yeah.
Sounds like it's best to get in touch. With you. Yeah. Greta asked, do you ever collaborate with Army Corps of Engineers?
Yeah, that's a good question. Trying to think. Certainly, certainly indirectly. So we do a lot of collaborations with the Department of Water Resources. The Department of Water Resources implements a lot of projects that require Army Corps of Engineer permits. And so, yeah, so there's definitely some indirect collaborations with the Army Corps of Engineers. But I think that, like, you know, a lot of Corps permits, so there's mitigation that's tied to that, right? And haven't had an opportunity yet to sit down with the Army Corps of Engineers and talk about like appropriate mitigation measures. But I'll get around to that for sure. So right now we haven't collaborated with the Army Corps of Engineers, but that's just a matter of time. Yeah, because they again are very interested in you know, making appropriate mitigation measures, right? So that these habitat restoration projects actually work. Yeah.
Okay. So Peter asks, in your production of native seed, do you advocate using chemical fertilizers or pesticides, or are you 100% organic?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things that's really essential when you're producing native seed is you can't have any weeds in it, right? Or you have to limit the amount of weeds in it. And in fact, the weeding is the most expensive part of producing native seed. It by far the most expensive part of that. And basically, in order to be able to produce high quality seed that people will actually buy, you have to use every tool in the toolbox, and that includes using herbicides. So that it's definitely not an organic operation. You have to use herbicides if you want to have high quality seed, unfortunately. Yeah.
Understood. Yeah. Joanna asked, are local ecotypes still well adapted to our changing climate? And what are you finding competitive ecotypes that will be able to resist reinvasion?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. That's really a debate amongst ecologists, right? So a lot of folks are starting to advocate maybe, for example, taking material that comes from southern areas where the climate might be a little drier, that's sort of more reflective of climate conditions that will be that'll be present in the future. But one of the things you have to keep in mind is that these evolutionary relationships, it's not only climate, right? It's a whole suite of things. You know, it's the insects that they've co-evolved with. It's the hydrology of the particular, although that's tied to the climate, of course. It's the diseases that are present. So it's really important that we keep that in mind. And so one of the things that they one of the ways that we found out the importance of sort of local genetics was with the Forest Service, that basically what they found is that they used to plant trees, ponderosa pine or what have you, from various different locations. And they found that like those trees would survive pretty well, in most years, but then the big climate event would come forward, like the big freeze. And then suddenly all of those trees would die. And what they found out is that they really had to tighten up the areas where these came from, so that because of the evolutionary relationship of these things basically being adapted to these weather events that come out that occur not very often, right? That every 15 or 20 or 30 years, those kinds of things. So I think it's really important that we maintain those local ecotypes to the extent possible. We definitely do have to recognize that essentially the climate is changing, and maybe part of what we need to do is to think a little bit about what's going to happen in the future. But let's not go and sort of start taking material from Southern California and using it sort of wholesale in Northern California. So
thank you very much for that answer. That was a great way to answer it. We've been if on our YouTube channel, there's a really wonderful presentation by Dr. David Ackerley, UC Berkeley, where he talks about the velocity of change and how systems just adapt on their own and are adapting on their own, and of course have been for a long time. So that's a nice answer that you had there. Very eloquent. Thank you.
Jean asks, isn't it difficult to tell the difference between tropical milkweed and native milkweed?
No, they're pretty distinctly different. I think there are about 15 or 16 different species of milkweed that are native to California. I think that it's pretty easy. Like one of the things that it's not recommended, of course, you probably heard is to not plant the tropical milkweed, right? And because the tropical milkweed tends to hold on to its vegetation. It doesn't die back like our native milkweeds do. And because of that, you end up having monarch butterflies. They think that might disrupt their migration. Also, it ends up being because of the large number of visitations, they think that it could promote this disease called OE as part of that. So I don't consider myself a botanist, but I do think that they are pretty distinctly different compared to a lot of the different natives that are out there. So I think it's easy to tell them apart. Yeah.
Nice. Hallie asked, how do you identify a valley oak? They have two large oaks in their yard, and already they don't know what they are.
Oh, very good. Okay. So the valley oak, its scientific name is Quercus lobata, right? And lobata, that has to do with very deeply lobed leaves that are that make up sort of the shape of the leaf. So you've got these indentations, these lobes that are very, that are very distinctive. They're also, it's winter time, so things haven't leaked out. So they're a deciduous tree, right? So they're not going to have leaves this year as compared to, say, a coastline oak, which is evergreen, which will still have leaves. So, but mostly, when they do have those leaves, it's they're pretty easy to distinguish. Also, the acorns are very distinctive. They have these very long acorns. They're one of their common names might have been in the past long acorn oak. So, but kind of at a very quickly looking at the deeply lobed leaves is the easiest way to tell them apart.
Nice.
So the next question is, Christina is stumped as to when to cut back old growth without disturbing overwintering beneficials. They want to make sure that new plants have enough sun to come forth and have a terrible crabgrass issue, but also the grass is draping down a hill next to a small creek. She's asking when is a good time to cut all dead growth back. She lives in zone 9 north of Sacramento.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think about that a lot myself in my own gardens, right? Because just exactly what she's talking about here is like, come the fall, you want to basically, create some room for your annual flowers to come in. And if you've got, say, for example, if your bunch grasses are basically, the old vegetation started to grow out into your open soils that will occupy, your wildflowers. There's a pretty strong desire, for example, to cut that back. And we do know that things like, like the hollow stems of lupins and things like that can provide nesting habitat for lots of different insects. So I think it sort of depends. And I think do your best to try and hold off as long as possible. But keep in mind also that maybe if you hold off too long, perhaps you will limit the amount of your annuals that will be able to come back and provide that other habitat benefit. So, don't feel too bad about cutting back old material. It's kind of it's I guess case by case basis, right? So.
Cool, man. Cherry's asking, is there scientific evidence that native grasses, perennials, I'm presuming, are less fire prone, more fire resistant than annual invasive grasses?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, there's a lot of work that's being done now with fires, of course, right? That's a big issue, right? We've all seen that in California. It's really burning. I don't have a paper in my back pocket that specifically, describes native grasses having being less fire prone than non-native grasses, but I think it's pretty obvious that the fuel load in non-native annual grasses tends to be much higher, and that a lot of times native grasses will end up, they'll end up staying greener for longer as compared to the very dry, hot tinder material, if you will, of the non-native annual grasses. So I don't have a paper in my back pocket, but in my opinion, they are less prone to significant fires. So.
There are quite a few more questions, so I'm not sure on your time and availability. Maybe, one option is we could send you the questions and you could answer them separately, or I don't know.
There's about 6 or 8 more questions.
Yeah, no, I'd rather answer the questions. If
okay.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Some of these are sort of technical, so you're doing a great job of handling them. Are there preferred slopes, grades, orientations, or specific ecosystems with bare soil that native ground nesting bees like? I'm presuming it depends on the bee.
Yeah, no, that's another good question. Well, of course, bare soil areas are not, you're not going to find those in areas that have, really deep and thick soils, right? So I think in general, oftentimes you find bare soil areas in some areas that are thinner, also you find bare soil areas end up occur after fires, right? And so that's another way that you often find that. One time I was asking Neil Williams about any ideas that he had about, Neil Williams from UC Davis, any ideas he had about sort of creating nesting habitat in bare soil areas. And he mentioned sand, sort of having areas, putting areas of sand as a potential area that would create, habitat for ground nesting bees. And I haven't really tried that, but I think, the areas that have thinner soils tend to be, in general, tend to have more bare soil than other areas. Yeah.
Okay.
Compacted soils sometimes too as well.
Joanna asks about the intersection between ecology and social sciences. Have you seen correlations between wealthy neighborhoods having more green space?
Hey, Joanna, how are you? Yeah, this is her area of study. Let's see. I think wealthy neighborhoods do tend to have more green spaces, right? I think that's pretty obvious, right? Certainly. So I think there is a correlation between that, right? That historically, wealthier neighborhoods are going to have larger lots. They're going to have more open space. You're not going to get as much green space, and I don't have a paper necessarily on that, but I think there is definitely a correlation between wealthier neighborhoods and more green space.
Clearly the case here in San Francisco.
Yeah, go to Atherton, right?
I think National Geographic may have done something on there.
Mm-hmm. Christina asked, are there any gray water projects going on to maintain trees in suburban neighborhoods that you know of in Northern California?
Oh boy. I'm sure there are. But I don't know of any specifically. I think folks are trying to use water resources, gray water, to the extent possible. Certainly are projects where folks are using gray water for their gardens, right? Capturing that water, separating out the gray water from other areas and making sure that goes into their gardens. So I'm sure they're happening, but I don't know of any specifically. And I know they're happening on an individual basis, right? So, yeah.
Cool. Carrie asked, where can we find the study and results from the 2018 class on social ecological connectivity class? That's an amazing project, which could be duplicated in so many venues.
Yeah. I did a little write-up for it in the Grasslands Journal. So that's the journal of the California Native Grassland Association. It's pretty easy to thumb through those. They're available online. So if you go to cnga.org, I think there's a Grasslands Journal link there. Maybe about 3 or 4 years ago, I wrote that up. So so that would be a place that's probably the best write-up of that. Yeah. So, but one thing is, then I also have a copy of the student study, which has a lot more information. These were undergraduate students that put it together, right? So it's it's not like a paper that would go in a referee journal, but send me an email and I could see if I could send you a copy of the students' paper if you like, and certainly go on to the cnga.org and find that Grasslands article on the project.
And Beverly asks, can you suggest smaller anchor trees for small city lots that cannot manage oaks?
Well, one thing to keep in mind that there are scrub oaks, right? There are oak species that are, like scrub oak itself. Quercus berberidifolia is one that's a native oak. That's a shrub, right? So that's just there's one way to get an oak in, right? And then yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean there are a lot of great native trees that are smaller. Buckeye is kind of a nice one. Asclepias californica. I like that one. That has great flowers for butterflies, for example. Creates a nice seed. What else? Smaller trees. Sambucus used to be Mexicana, the blue elderberry. I forget what the new name is for that. Would be another one. Blue elderberry is a good one. Yeah, let's see. What else is kind of on the smaller side? Acer negundo, kind of a medium-sized tree. That's kind of a good habitat tree. It has a good structure. Not as big as the valley oak. Might work pretty well in an urban setting. A little kind of a medium-sized tree as opposed to a large tree. Yeah. So.
Thanks.
Keys asked, how well do annual plantings persist without extensive weeding? No, there's lots of variables involved in there. And you talked about mixing them with perennials. Will invasive plants ultimately take over the world? Oh, no, he didn't say that. I said that. Or can natives hold their own once established?
That's a really good question. Like, and to be perfectly honest, it does take extra work to get those native annual species to give you spectacular floral displays every year. I think just about anywhere in California, with the exception of maybe high mountain areas, weeds are a problem, right? So I think weeding is just a necessity and an important part of like having a good floral display. So I don't really have a magic bullet for that, except just to get in there and weed. I'm constantly weeding, but it's the reward is so great for that, right? So.
Oh yeah, we have a lot of weed warriors here, and we're looking for more. If anybody's out there who wants to help us weed community plots. Patty asked if your nursery is open to the public, the heritage growers.
It's not a public nursery, but we do take orders from folks. So you just have to give us a call or send us an email. It's geared towards habitat restoration, right? So we have a 600 plant minimum, for example, and basically what we'll do is we'll talk to you on the phone and tell you what's available and set you up to come and pick up the material at a specific time. But it's really, there's not really a retail sort of nursery. And so and again, they're these plugs. They're small plants, right? So they're pretty cost effective. And so and you would plant them on tighter centers. So and I know for some people like to buy 600 plants is certainly a burden. So you can think about things of maybe going in with your neighbors, maybe starting your own little habitat project where you're maybe buying some plants together and making some connections with your neighbors, but yeah, just send me an email or give me a call and we'll let you know what we got and set something up for you. So.
Great. Laura asked, did you run into any problems with local agencies like water and fire in your community planning effort? Fire agencies usually look horrified when you say you want to plant grasses. They consider them highly flammable.
Yeah, no, we haven't run into any issues with with fire agencies. I was 11 years on our local fire district, and what we would do is that we would have to go out and take a look at different areas, and if there were large patches of dry vegetation, we would require the person to sort of cut back on the amount of fuel, but none of the habitat patches that we created were ever sort of large enough that it ended up having to weed whack them, for example. So yeah, so we didn't run into any problems.
And I'd say, Laura, there's California Native Plant Society has done a lot of research, extensive research, and they consult with the state authorities on that. And there's a pamphlet available on their site, or there's some guidebooks there that are available. So you might do a search on that. Joe asked, how important are green corridors in urban landscapes?
Oh, I think they're really important. Yeah, I think it's really an essential part of a quality existence. It's an important part of providing habitat. I think they're really important for urban corridors and urban landscapes. It's our opportunity really to create significant patches of habitat. One of the great things about living in Davis is that there's lots of great corridors and they use lots of native species, and it really brings up the quality of life. So I think it's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Anne asked suggestions for good habitat trees for small urban yards.
Okay. Well, I think we talked about that a little bit earlier, right? So
so I think you covered that one pretty well. We love our Toyon in our small yard, and
Toyon is a good one. Maybe we'll talk about that for a minute. So Toyon, I think of kind of that intermediate between a shrub and a tree. But one of the great things about Toyon is it provides a really great habitat for bees in the springtime, and in the wintertime, those berries. Eddie, as you I'm sure really great habitat for birds, right? Get these swarms of robins that come in and feed on the, anyway, Toyon's a good one too.
My only complaint is that the robins and the waxwings come in and clean the thing out in like a week's time. It's pretty cool, amazing when they're there though. Yeah. Carol asked, that's more for us. Okay, last question, I promise. With the disruption of the rain season apparent, when is the best time to plant? Earlier in the fall, or supplementary watering becoming more important?
I think that's a really important question. I think fall still remains the best time to plant. I think one of the things that you can do when you're initially establishing your habitat garden is that it's important to try to have good weed control from the very beginning. And so if you're starting from scratch, I would go out and I would irrigate in September, after the temperatures have dropped. So they've dropped enough that they're going to basically, germinate the weeds, get those weeds up, control those weeds, and then plant in the month of October. And then just be prepared to potentially having to supplement that with irrigation. I kind of, in my yard, I sort of treat it a little bit like a farm, right? So I'm really working towards kind of maximizing habitat values. Again, getting toward this idea that using that water to create habitat is environmental water, if you will. I think it's okay. I think it's okay to use water to create habitat. I think it's a good use of water. So I feel good about that. In my opinion.
Patrick, that was really well done, man. I think you may have the record number of questions asked.
Oh, that's great.
In the 2 years now that we've been doing Zoom speaker programs, there's like almost 30 questions got asked of you.
That's so great.
And I omitted the one about wanting you to talk to Matt Ritter about not planting Southern California plants up in Northern California, but I think it's an LA Bay Area thing myself. So since you're in Davis, you're free from that.
It's like the Giants and the Dodgers, right? Something like that.
Yeah. And the Giants will rock.
That's right. Yep.
Well, thanks so much.
Thanks again. Really fun.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That was great. Appreciate all the questions. Folks, feel free to give me a call or send me an email. I'm happy to advocate and help out to get native vegetation established as much as we can. So thanks so much.
All right. Best of luck on your new endeavors too.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks, man.
Yep.
Bye, everybody.